we are extremely fortunate to have Chunka Mui speak to us today over the next 45 minutes. And those of you that have seen him speak, I'm sure are excited. Those of you who haven't, I think it's the next few minutes, it's going to stimulate some of your ideas on innovation. Chunka is the leading expert on innovative companies. He goes into companies and really pressure tests and stress tests innovation strategies. You know, we have a strategy on innovation. He'll come in and say, hey, you're on the right track. You aren't. Here's what you need to do more of, less of. And his company that he formed, which has this great name, it's called Devil's Advocate. You know, you ever in a meeting and someone's a devil's advocate? Now, sometimes you want to throw something at them, right? But Chunka has been doing this for 20 years plus. He's written books, and he's not here to sell any books. But what he's here to do is just to stimulate our ideas of innovation. Starts with you. It starts with everybody. And innovative companies outperform their competitors. And innovative companies have better shareholder value than companies that just do it from an incremental way. Chunka has articles written in Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and is known throughout the United States and the world as a leader in innovation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Chunka Mui.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, I am really thrilled and honored to be here. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with some of the folks in this audience for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. So I've seen your company. I know all about it. But my experience with you actually goes even before that. About almost 25 years ago now, I'm dating myself, my sister and my brothers came to me and they said, wouldn't it be a great bonding experience if we all built a vacation house together? And little did I know that they meant literally build a vacation house together. So I am well familiar with your products. Sheetrock, drywall tape, I've used them all, I lifted them all up. So, but as a student of business, I've also know very well and appreciate very much the efforts that you all have gone through over the last 5, 6, 7 years. It's been quite a hard slog, hasn't it? It reminds me of the saying by Andy Grove, who was one of the co-founders, the CEO and former chairman of Intel. This is what he said. And I think it really applies to you. You haven't just survived the crisis. You haven't just made it through. You certainly weren't destroyed by it. In a lot of ways, you were improved by it. So you've dealt with the cost issue, brought down your break even. You've expanded into the fastest growing market in the world. And you've innovated. You've brought out product innovations in the face of that crisis that I would have loved to have had 25 years ago. So I think really you deserve a round of applause. I actually think you deserve a larger round of applause than that. Come on. So, here's the problem that you now face. Everything that you've done over the last 5 years has now become table stakes for your competitors. Because they have no choice but to match you. Right? They have to get the quality of their operations up. They have to get the quality of their products up. That's what business is. It's a game of how do you compare? And they need to compare to where you are in one way or another. So the challenge for you is when they inevitably catch up to where you are now, where are you going to be? where are you going to be? Because winning in business is never permanent. Winning in business really just means leading and the opportunity to stay ahead. So, as Jim said earlier, what are we going to do next? And that next is continual. You always have to keep on getting better because the market catches up with you, and you have to be ahead of them. Otherwise, they get ahead of you. And the challenge is that innovation is very hard. I mean, let's face it. You've had a lot of hard work over the last 5 years, and if you're going to keep that pace, it will be even harder. And the reality is that most companies fail at innovation. Here are some really depressing numbers. It's very hard to introduce new products. Most companies that try to do it fail. It's very hard to get into new markets. Even more companies fail. And it's very hard to acquire companies. Most people who try to do that fail. That's why if you look over the last 10 years, the companies, almost half the companies that were in the Fortune 500 list are no longer there. Innovation is hard, otherwise everybody would be succeeding at it. Now, but there's another way of looking at this. Because innovation is hard, the rewards are that much greater. So if you look at the same numbers, 35 to 55% of new products succeed. Companies that go into new markets can succeed. And a third of companies that acquire increase the value of their own companies. So the challenge is, how are you in the second category versus the first? That is the opportunity in front of you. Because 273 of those Fortune 500 companies are still on the list. They're innovating. They're improving faster than the market, faster than the competition, and they're growing. And that's the category that you want to be in. So how do you do that? This, I think, is the central question that I want to address today. So if you look at the winners and you look at the losers, what separates them? How do you stay in the winning category as opposed to moving to the losing category? And this is really the question that I've been researching and working on all of my career. As Jim said, I've worked with hundreds of large companies on our innovation strategies, and I've researched thousands more. Much of the learnings there have been captured in these 3 books over the last almost 20 years. And what I want to do is to focus on that, to draw from that experience, to talk to you about how do you take that next step? What do you do next? How do you innovate? And hopefully bring those learnings to you so that when you work to stay ahead of the competition, you remain successful. So if I look at a very high level, 3 major issues separate the winners from the losers. 3 major issues separate from the winners from the losers. The winners tend to think big. They're always constantly evaluating the critical assumptions about their own ways of doing business, the environment around them, and they're willing to ask tough questions of themselves about whether or not they should continue to do so. They dare to dream big. They dare to dream big as the starting point. Losers, the failures over time, are the companies that don't do that. They think small. It's sort of human nature to think that the future iterations of your business, the future iterations of your challenges, are just incremental adaptations of the past. As you came into this room, you saw a wonderful exhibition on bicycles, right? And innovations around bicycles. And I'm not sure if you saw, there were a number, in the history of bicycles, there were a number of bicycles from the Schwinn Bicycle Company. How many of you had a Schwinn when you were younger? Many, many of you. You know, the Schwinn headquarters, the global Schwinn headquarters, is just a few blocks from used to be a few blocks from where your headquarters is now. And it was owned by who? Schwinn's. The Schwinn bicycle company went out of business because they missed the leap to mountain bikes. The Schwinn, who was the CEO at the time, saw this crazy, trend that was happening where people were riding these bikes with, strange gear systems, big tires, and said, that's a fad. And they missed it completely. And over time, their worldwide dominance in bicycles went like that. And they had to sell the company. So the Schwinn bicycle company you see now is actually 3 or 4 bankruptcies since the original one that used to be near your office. Schwinn thought small. He thought that the bicycle business would continue to be the bicycle business that his father built. And the product changed out from underneath him. That's the danger when you think small. You miss the big changes. Right? But the successes, after they think big, start small. They don't just get this big idea and go all in, jump on the bandwagon, and drive hard at it. They break it down. They say, okay, it's a big idea. Some of it is intuition, some of it is creativity, some of it is hope. How do I separate all of that and break down the problem and invest in it incrementally? The companies that fail tend to swing from complacency to panic. They say, oh my goodness, we missed a big trend. What are we going to do? Well, let's grab the best idea we can and bet big on that because we have no choice. And big bets without due diligence are inevitably failures. So they think small and then bet big. Companies that think big and start small have the opportunity to learn fast. They have the opportunity to take a rigorous scientific approach to innovation. They get to do many, many cycles and find their way to the right answer. Because in the initial parts of innovation, you're really sort of understanding what the question is, as well as the answer. And after you come up with a really good, thorough understanding of the question, then you can work rigorously at the answer. Companies that start small and then, or think small and then bet big, have no time for learning. All they can do is execute as hard as they can and hope that they're on the right track. And oftentimes, they're not. Oftentimes, they're not. So, 3 major issues that separate them: think big, start small, learn fast. And if you were to sort of think about this at a really high level in terms of game plan for innovation, this is it, right? You start by thinking big, you break it down to the smaller components, smallest versions of your big idea, the component parts of your big idea, and you try to cycle as often as possible and iterate. To do that, you have to start early, because you have to have time to do it. So what I want to do the rest of this presentation is to break this game plan down. Because when we look across these 3 areas in our research, we found 8 critical points. 8 critical points that companies that succeed got right, and that companies fail tended to get wrong. And these are points that we believe if you fail in any one of them, the whole process is doomed to fail. Right? So what I'm going to give you essentially is 8 rules that you have to think about. A checklist for the things that you have to do, whether you're thinking about innovation at the enterprise level, at the business unit level, or within a certain function. These are the things that you have to get right. They don't guarantee success, but missing them does guarantee failure. So let's start by thinking big. How do you think big? And Marshall McLuhan said that, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. Because we all live inside some environment, and we tend to miss those critical things that define it because they're so all around us. We don't think much about oxygen until it disappears. We also don't think very much about the fundamental assumptions that are built into our business until we're forced to somehow, or unless we make a conscious decision to. One of the big drivers of business change, I believe, in every industry across the economy is information technology. Right? These are sort of horizontal disruptors, and there are 6 that I believe have sort of gotten past the research stage and now are really moving into every aspect of how we live, how we conduct business, and driving sort of the expectations of everyone and everything around you. So how many of you have the greatest communication device known to man? One of these things, whatever brand, smartphones, right? More computing capacity on this phone than on a supercomputer 15 years ago. And we all have it in our pockets. How many of your customers do you think have one of these smartphones in their pockets? Anyone venture to guess? All of them, yes. How many of your customers' customers have one of these devices in their pocket? All of them. How do you think that changes the nature of how you have to operate? The expectations that people place on you, the expectations that your customers' customers place on them, the person walking into Home Depot, how does it change the expectations of the people in Home Depot on you? It's just being able to sort of bring a point of computing, a point of information to your hand wherever you are, I think is a tremendous disruptor, tremendous driver. Social media, right, is the second technology that I think is really, really powerful because it influences how we communicate with each other. You did a rebranding recently, right? I think it's beautiful stuff. The ability for your customers to essentially encapsulate your brand, their opinion of your brand, easily and to disseminate it will overwhelm whatever your advertising strategy, advertising budget is around your new brand. Your brand is defined by what they say to each other, and that's very much amplified by social media. Pervasive cameras. You know, the fact that every contractor, every construction worker, every customer can take advantage of that saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. To bring cameras to every site, to bring cameras into the construction process, bring cameras into the sales process, purchasing process. And the fact that, you know, I have 2 of them in this phone, and pretty soon I'll probably have 4 or 6, and there'll be 3D cameras. That's the kind of pervasive change that we're seeing in the information technology landscape. Others that you can probably recognize immediately in terms of their importance, embedded sensors. Right? Embedded sensors in my shoes, in my belt, in my pacemaker, whatever it is, embedded sensors in the walls, in the home, and in buildings. There are vineyards that fly over their grapes, dropping sensors the size of pennies out the plane so that they can have a accurate reading of humidity and temperature at a very point-wise level. They call it dust. They just drop it out. And they create little mesh networks to communicate the information back. It's that cheap, you know, to have that kind of information. How long will it be before somebody puts sensors in drywall to monitor mold? Or in ceilings to monitor humidity? Cloud computing, which is just a way of talking about, you know, having information and technology centralized in the cloud so that it can bring it to the point of need anywhere. Right? So that my phone, with more storage capacity than, again, supercomputers 20 years ago, not only has that, but also has access to everything known in the history of mankind, accessible through the network. Right? That level of information. And finally, big data and emergent knowledge. The ability to take all this information coming through the sensors, coming through the phones, coming through the history of all your transactions, and be able to do predictive analytics on them. These are trends that, as I say, are hitting every information-intensive industry. And can anybody name an industry today that's not information-intensive? I certainly can't. I certainly can't. And yours certainly is very information-intensive. So these are the kinds of things that I think you have to think about in every part of your business. How does this technology play out in how I think about how I operate, how I plan to operate, and the expectations on me? So I'm going to give you some examples now. How many of you are car lovers? How many of you are car lovers? So here's something that's happening to the car industry. You know, I love cars as an example because it's actually an industry that's older than yours. Some of the companies that are in the car industry have been there longer in one form or another. And they've sort of developed along this line, this very incremental line over time. Cars don't change that much. They don't change that much. And, you know, some people would say that car in the 50s in a lot of ways better than cars today. But one of the things that is happening in the car industry is that the technology available to the industry is advancing at this exponential curve level. Exponential curve level. Because the technology, that technology is information technology. There's an old principle called Moore's Law, which has observed that the power of computing is essentially doubled every 18 months for the last 50 years, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. That information technology is what's on this exponential curve. So when you think about innovation in general, big innovation in general, and I'll tell you how it applies to cars in a minute, these two lines of incremental expectations of change and exponential progression of technology create these gaps over time. I call them killer apps. Right? They are revolutionary changes in either product or process that create game-changing changes inside your organizations. And the reason they happen is because markets abhor vacuums. You know, if there's some opening between what companies in the markets are doing and what's technologically possible, the market will fill it somehow with innovation. It can be by the companies themselves or by new entrants. So if we look at a bunch of beautiful cars over a range of time, from Model T to you pick your favorite brand, and we think about how information technology is changing this industry. Let me give you a quick example.
So when you look at transportation today, it's really amazing. You can get from A to B just so quickly compared to, 100 years ago. But the cost of that, in the US, 33,000 people are killed every year. To put that in perspective, it's the leading cause of deaths for people between the ages of 4 and 34. 90+% of that is human error. And so if we can bring in technology that's always paying attention, that can see what's going on around it, that never gets distracted, this is a huge opportunity. This is one of these kind of 10x kind of opportunities to save lives and make the world a better place.
Who's the project director of the self-driving car project at Google. How many of you are familiar with the self-driving car project? It's really neat stuff. So he's leading the charge on it. And here's an example of how it might work.
Good morning, Steve. Hey, Nathaniel. How are you? Doing just great. Go ahead, Steve.
Auto driving.
Here we go. Away we go. Look, Ma, no hands.
No hands anywhere.
No hands, no feet.
No hands, no feet, no nothing.
I love it. So we're here at the stop sign. Yep. Car's using radars and laser to check and make sure there's nothing coming either way. I find myself looking. Old habits die hard, man. They don't die. This is some of the best driving I've ever done.
That was Steve Mahan, who's actually 95% blind. Can you imagine if you could actually have cars drive themselves? as opposed to what we're used to is driving them. Here's some additional auto-related context. Each year in the US, over 34,000 people are killed in car accidents. Almost 250,000 are hospitalized, 2 million are injured, and something on the order of 9.5 million cars are involved in almost 5 million accidents. The estimates are that the total cost of those car accidents, when you look at property damage, hospitalization, car damage, human injuries, opportunity costs, $480 billion. $480 billion each year in the US. Worldwide, 1.2 million people are injured in car accidents, and more than 50 million, 1.2 million are killed in car accidents, and more than 50 million are injured. That's the context around which the folks at Google are innovating. Because they say, look, as he said, 90% of car accidents due to human error. What are the possibilities if we could apply information technology to take those bad drivers out of the loop? A fundamental assumption. You have to have people driving. They took that away and said, how can we change that to address this really big problem, which has a big human price tag and a big economic price tag attached to it? So if you look at cars overall, that 480 billion is actually dwarfed by this number, $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion is the annual car-related expenditures in the US economy. $2.5 trillion. More than $100 billion going to tier 1 suppliers, more than $250 billion going to automakers, almost $600 billion in new and used car sales flowing through car dealers, $100 billion each year in collision and repairs, $200 billion a year in auto insurance premiums. If you have a fundamental redefinition of the core product, how much of that goes up for grabs? How much of it doesn't have to be spent, and how much of it will have to be competed for in new ways? That's the level of disruption that's going on in the car industry, in the car-related industry, due to the same set of information technology that I believe will affect you. So let's talk a little bit about your business. Estimates are that there will be about 7 billion people in the world, that almost 1 billion of them have substandard housing. Buildings account for almost half of energy usage, create half of carbon emissions, account for, in the US, about 40% of, or construction debris accounts for about 40% of landfills. Some estimates are that over the next 30 years, to accommodate rise in population and growth in emerging economies, we will build more buildings in the next 30 years than we have in the last 3,000 years. That's the context in which you sit. Massive problems, massive opportunities. Let me give you a couple of examples of how information technology, I think, is poised to disrupt the context in which you operate. This first example is a clip of a talk just given a couple weeks ago by Michelle Kaufman, who is an architect, but also a co-founder of a small company called Flux. Flux is actually the first spin-off company of the Google X organization that created driverless cars. This was part of a different research project, and they've spun off this startup, which has just come out of stealth mode, as she will describe. Here, if you can't see in the back, as she's evolving this design from a library of designs, the system is telling her things like, if you have this design, what's the overall energy usage? What's the occupancy? How many parking spaces will you need? What's the cost? Cost per square foot, gross area. These are the kinds of things that the system is calculating in the background based upon the design options that she's choosing. And it generates a full bill of materials, costs at the SKU level. So fundamental changes to how buildings are designed and potential ripple effects down the chain. That's the design process. As you know, there are also major changes going on in the process of building. And I want to show you a quick example of that.
So we're just architects, and we're currently 3D printing a Canal house. The thing is, we were already printing with these smaller printers for a long time, but as architects we were thinking, what would this actually mean for architecture? What if you really could 3D print buildings? We can really recycle waste materials into printable materials, eliminate large transport costs, really make unique and personalized architecture. You can print buildings and then just shredder them and then print them anew. And then we said, let's just do it.
So we went to Ultimaker, the guys who made the small printers, and we said, can't we make a printer with which we can build a house?
We need actually a rapid building technique to keep up the pace of the growth of the megacities. And we think 3D printing can actually be that technique to provide good housing for the billions of people on this planet. With the Kamermaker, we are printing each room by room.
So the rooms we're currently designing, you can soon just download them online, assemble them digitally into your favorite house design, just attach materials to it, and then just press print.
We really see 3D printing as a new craft. The rooms are first tested on the small printers, and once the file is completely finalized, we send it to the big printer. Because the technique in the small printers is exactly the same as in the big one, we can use the same files. So the innovation is not only in the technique, but it's also in the design. So the rooms we build consist of elements in which we combine ornament, structure, inner facade and outer facade in one. We can change the design according to different parameters. And just imagine that you can print with solar panels, for instance, and suddenly you can really position the house so that it's oriented towards the sun, and your house really becomes one big power plant. We started printing with plastics because that's the material that works best with this FDM printing technique. So we're currently developing a new bio-based 3D printing material that's really especially made for 3D printing architecture. That's both really sustainable, strong and beautiful.
I know, as you know very well, that your industry changes very slowly. It changes very incrementally. There are a lot of people involved. It's very fragmented. And old practices always change slowly because there are people associated with those practices who want to work that way. These practices are improving along that exponential curve. And it may take 5, 10, 15 years for these examples to affect you. I'm not sure. That's actually a question for you to face, right? How fast will they affect you? And more generally, what is the context for innovation for USG? I mean, we look at pressures like sustainability, competitive pressures around costs, quality, customer intimacy, technology, information technology, materials technology, building technology. What challenges does that create for you? What opportunities does that create for you? That, I think, is the first big question that you have to step back and address when you think about innovation at every level of your company. Context is worth 80 IQ points. So let's talk about the other 7 rules. Number 2 is embracing your doomsday scenario. This means that when you think about that context, you not only look at opportunities, but you look at the challenges. What might come and kill you if you miss it? What's your equivalent of the mountain bikes that Schwinn missed? What's your equivalent of the smartphone that Motorola and Microsoft and Nokia missed? What's your doomsday scenario? And let me give you an example, continuing the car thread. We spend $200 billion a year in the US annually on commercial and personal auto insurance. In the world of driverless cars, with many fewer accidents, how much car insurance will we need? As Warren Buffett says, no accidents, no insurance. So if you want to talk about a doomsday scenario that comes out of a great technological advance, that's what's facing the auto insurance companies. Can you imagine if the need for your products fundamentally just went away? That's the doomsday scenario. So understanding the downside is really very important because it lets you know what you're facing. But sometimes it also accelerates your move to innovate because you say to yourself, look, if that's coming, how do I leverage my assets to address that? Or how do I leverage my assets to defend against that? And how do I use that knowledge to rally the troops around the need to do something? So embracing your doomsday scenario gives you a great advantage in terms of understanding your context. So what is the doomsday scenario for USG? What is something that could happen, perhaps out of left field, or perhaps just sooner than you expected, that could radically change your business? Any ideas? A replacement of drywall. You're going into a market where they don't actually use drywall on walls, do they? They use them on the ceilings. Well, could that change? What else? What else? Over here, somebody had something. Come on, let it flow for a couple minutes. Amazon supply. And why might Amazon supply be a doomsday scenario?
Because they could actually apply technology to the contractors that get them better information when they needed it, as well as standardized pricing.
Standardized pricing, apply technology to contractors, delivery when they needed it. All the things that you expect from Amazon today, every day, from home. Same functionality brought to the job site. What else? What was that? Speak up.
So increasing organization, increasing demand, increasing demand for smaller living spaces, thereby less demand for our product.
Less demand for your product, right, right. There are, I think, in this room, probably more expertise on the potential demise of your business than anywhere in the world. How can you draw that out? How can you give voice to the fears and use that to your advantage? All right, so after you understand your doomsday scenario, there's another even harder exercise, which is to think about your business absent of the constraints that you inevitably believe that are on you, right? The bounds and shackles of how you operate today. Can you wipe the slate clean and say, look, if we had all the assets that we have, all the skills, all the knowledge, all the competency that we have, but we came in tomorrow and all the procedures were gone, all the legacy systems were gone, all the contracts were gone, and the only constraint you had was, you couldn't violate laws of physics and you couldn't break the law. How would you redesign your business? How would you redesign your business? So let's take the car example a couple of steps further. Imagine cars in the context of driverless cars. How might they look? What changes? No steering wheel. What else? More comfort. You don't have to what? You don't have to face forward. Beautiful. What else? No gas pedals. You might not need the same kind of all that steel around you in terms of that big harness. You don't need rear view mirrors. You don't need brakes. What system? Entertainment systems, right? You could spend all your time eating tacos and watching movies. It could be your living room. You might also do other things differently. You might say, well, you look, it's really a computer. I should have backup systems. Maybe I should have fault tolerance. Maybe I need, 2 electrical systems, not 1. Here's how it might look.
Today, we have something extra special for you guys, and you guys will be some of the first people outside of our team and outside of Google to ever ride in it.
Oh, there it is. Oh, isn't that cute?
Go ahead and buckle up.
Okay, Annie, here we go. Yeah. All right, Cody, let's go. There's no steering wheel in the way.
It was a big decision for us to go and start building our purpose-built vehicles for this. And really, they're prototype vehicles. They were a chance for us to explore what does it really mean to have a self-driving vehicle. But in the small amount of time we've been working on it, we have functional prototypes, and that's exciting.
It's really cool. It was like really kind of a space age experience.
Oh, okay. Hooray! We're like queens. Yeah.
You said relax. You don't need to do nothing. It knows when it needs to stop. It knows when it needs to go.
It actually rides better than my own car.
Yes, sure.
What she really liked was that it slowed down before it went around a curve and then accelerated in the curve. She's always trying to get me to do it that way.
That's the way I learned in a high school driver's ed.
So if I had a self-driving car, I could spend more time hanging out with my kids or helping them with their homework, even just tending to them, finding out how their day was and not having to wait till you get home and have dinner and all that. So it'll be good.
Human feeling of it is very well engineered, and it is very smooth. There's nothing that makes you feel the least bit threatened. It's impressive. I'm totally in love with this whole concept.
That's the first of about 200 prototypes that's going to be driving around San Francisco by the end of the year. A car redesigned from the ground up to be self-driving. So no steering wheel. They still have seat belts. The shape of it, I think it's intentionally designed to be sort of warm and fuzzy and non-threatening. But also the shape of it is defined by the fact that it creates no blind spots for the radar. You'll see that, if you couldn't see it here, the front of the car is actually built with foam, because 30 to 40% of car accident victims are pedestrians that are hurt by the bumper, the really hard bumper and the hard front part of the car. So the front part of this car is very soft. Things like that. So you used to think, hey, let's take away the constraints of how cars have always been built and start from scratch. How it might look different. But let's go beyond cars. Let's reimagine what transportation would look like in the world of driverless cars. So what might be different in terms of, what do you hate about cars? What do you hate about, your cars today? Throw out some stuff. Cost of gas, maintenance, that those driverless car prototypes are electric, construction, road construction, traffic jams. Does anybody like parking? Statistics are actually that even though cars are parked 95% of the time, which means they're really poorly utilized, a third of traffic in downtown centers are people circling looking for parking spots. If you had a driverless car, you wouldn't have to park. It could drop you off. You walk in the building, it drives off somewhere else, right, to park. And you know what? If that were true, you would need downtown parking garages. The car could drop you off at 500 West Adams, and go park, on Canal Street down by, the Dominick's on Roosevelt Road where all the buses park, rather than parking in an expensive parking lot. Imagine the possibilities of all that commercial real estate devoted to parking was freed up for something else. Imagine the possibilities if you didn't have to own your car, if there was no big upfront cost, but rather it was just a taxi that came to you when you needed it. Because, of course, if you had a driverless car, it could serve multiple people over the course of the day rather than, driving in from Naperville, parking in the lot, and then driving it back home 8, 9, 10, 12 hours later when you're done with work. The possibilities are tremendous. Estimates are that the cost of taxi service could decrease by almost 80% if there were no driver. Other estimates are that the cost of personal mobile transportation, if you moved it from an ownership model to a shared model, could drop by 30 to 50%. An MIT and Stanford research study showed that just recently in Singapore, they did an analysis of all traffic in Singapore. Trains, buses, scooters, cars. It's only data you would have in Singapore. They could replace all of those personal transportation needs with about 300,000 cars, 300,000 shared driverless cars, with a response time at peak traffic times of about 15 minutes to get service. 300,000 cars is about a third of the number of cars, personally owned cars in Singapore today. Those are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. So how many of you have used Uber? Right, Uber, you pull out your phone, you say where you are, and you get essentially a bid for a black car or a taxi service. It shows you where they are, when they can get to you. 4 minutes away shows you where they are when they get to you. Does all the financial transaction over the phone. What if you could combine Uber with Google driverless cars? That, I think, is a killer app that redefines transportation. So when you start from a clean sheet of paper, you can reimagine complex systems and how might they be defined. And by the way, a few months ago, Google invested $250 million in Uber. I wonder why. All right, so the question you have to face is, how do I think big? How do I reimagine USG? Right? Your part, the whole enterprise, your part of the business, how do you reimagine what that might be if you had no constraints? It's not that you can take away those constraints completely when you go to test those ideas or work on those ideas, but it sets a different set of possibilities in front of you. If you don't immediately put on the blinders of your legacy, both the good and the bad, it changes the possibilities, and then you can work towards them. So how do you work towards them? As I said before, the thing you have to make sure you don't do is you don't say, wow, this is a great idea. Jim, I need $500 million, and if you give me $500 million, I guarantee you that in 12 years I will reimagine the building and construction industry and our part in it. You can't do that. You have to be able to put aside the typical way that large companies do planning. Big companies plan, that's what they do. You have to break it down and be able to create the environment, the processes, and the culture that says, all right, great idea, let's start small. So the first rule of starting small is rule number 4. First, now Shakespeare said, let's kill all the lawyers. Our rule is you have to kill all the finance guys. Do you see a finance guy next to you? We've given him a pass, a finance guy or girl. Not that one, but in general. Right? Here's the problem. The typical way large companies make investments is they bet big. Well, if you're going to bet big, you're going to ask some really rigorous questions. What's my return? How much is it going to cost? What's my return? The problem is, and when we talk about big innovation, you never know. Up front, those are just guesses disguised as numbers. I know what the return has to be. I can work backwards in my spreadsheet to get you there, but buried in that spreadsheet are going to be 1,000 assumptions that I really have no idea about. So to start small, you have to put aside the way that we usually start when we bet big and say, how do we break it down? How do we take these guys and say, you know what? I can calculate the NPV for you. Sorry, Matt. I can calculate the NPV for you, but it's really not accurate. I don't know if the profits kick in the 3rd year or the 5th year. And you know what? That makes all the difference in the world. Right? So how can you sort of break it down and say, Matt, please, all I want is 50,000, 100,000. I just want this small amount. Please, could you wait over there for a while? And that's it. How do you defer some of the sort of big spreadsheets and modeling that we typically do? In return for that, we're not asking for a lot. We're saying we're starting small. So putting aside the financial constraints, the HR constraints, Brian, sorry, the HR constraints of, you know, who do we hire? What kind of talent can we bring in? You know, do they fit the mold or not fit the mold? Sometimes you have to say, you know, we're going to break those rules or at least relax them for a little bit up front. So, rule number 4, kill all the finance guys. Rule number 5, you have to remember that innovation is as much a social process as it is a creative process. Which means that when you have this big idea, you not only have to figure out whether or not it works and what it takes for it to work, you have to figure out who are all the people involved at various stages in the game in order for it to be loved and used. And I'll give you a negative example that I think you're probably well familiar with. How many of you worked with Home Depot in the days of Bob Nardelli? A few. Bob Nardelli lost the runoff to become CEO of General Electric, GE. And within 10 minutes after he lost that race, he was offered the CEO role at Home Depot. 10 minutes. When word hit the press that Nardelli was becoming CEO of Home Depot, the market value of Home Depot went up by $10 billion. He was that good. Because at that point in the year 2000, Home Depot had been growing really fast for decades, and the wheels were coming off. They were very decentralized, unfocused, and they had a competitor in Lowe's coming at them. And the market was saying, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And Nardelli was the savior. And when he came in, he almost immediately diagnosed the problem, and the board did as well, and that's why they hired him. Home Depot was very entrepreneurial, decentralized, and had grown that way to the point where they couldn't hold the organization together. You know, they had multiple purchasing departments, you know, making different kinds of deals with folks like you. They had store managers who were king inside their stores, who would take memos from headquarters and toss them away without reading them, new directives. Those were memos because they didn't have a enterprise-wide information technology system that could help them manage the organization. So Nardelli came in, and he did a lot of the right things. He centralized where he needed to. He invested hundreds of millions of dollars in information technology, cut out many layers of redundant management that had developed over time. And in the time he went there, I think sales went up, sales doubled, profits went up by 80%, margins went from 30% to 34%. He did really a great job. The problem was that he came from a command and control structure at GE that just did not work at Home Depot. He loved to say, well, you know, when he was talking about what needed to be done, look, I'm looking at my watch, not the calendar. You know, they would do things like massive redesigns of their purchasing organization in a weekend. And they had this great exercise where he brought all the senior managers together, they redesigned the purchasing department, and they had walls filled with names of people to move into new slots. They'd get somebody on the list, the manager would get on the phone, call that person, offer him a job. If he didn't say no right away, they cross his name off the list and go on to the next person. And in the weekend, they redesigned the purchasing organization, and it was a beautiful redesign. Except that they lost the loyalty, right, of everybody below them. So what happened at Home Depot, as sales were going up, profits were going up, employee satisfaction was going down. And in concert with employee satisfaction going down, customer satisfaction was going down. And it got to the point where employees were calling the company Home Depot, right, because it was so countercultural against what the expectations were. At the same time, Nardelli didn't only lose the employees and the customers, he lost investors and analysts as well, because in his rush to re-engineer Home Depot, he couldn't really articulate the investor story about why those improvements were scalable and why there was growth, right? So he made the mistake that Nelson Mandela talked about. He led from the front, but he left his base behind. And he failed to realize that culture is more important than strategy. You have to get it both right in order for it to work. So in any big idea, whether it's the transformation of Home Depot or the next wave of innovation at USG, you have to think about, how do I get everybody on the right page? Now, you can't get everybody there sometimes. Well, then you also have to know who you can't get there. So understanding that social process is a big part about starting small, because cultures change very, very slowly. And you have to give them time to change. And you have to work at it. So the third rule, rule number 6, third rule about starting small, is that in addition to telling Matt that he can't have all the data he needs right away, you have to step back and make sure you're working on things that are small enough to deserve that kind of process, but that the value of them is high enough. So you have to think about options as opposed to investments. You have to think about small investments focused on a very short amount of time on a specific question that have high potential return if you're right, but don't cost you a lot if you're wrong. And you have to make sure there's enough of them to warrant the fact that some of them will fail, but not so many of them that you can't manage them. So a small basket of options. Right? I've talked a lot about Google in the car, but they really have an experimental process that matches this example. So they have an organization called Google X. They actually have a person whose title, actually a Chicago native, Astral Teller, grew up in Evanston. He's actually the only person that I've ever heard of who has 2 Nobel-winning grandparents. His title at Google is Captain of Moonshots. Captain of Moonshots. And their mantra is, what are the big problems that if I'm successful, I can get a 10x return? You heard Chris Urmson talking about 10x return of the cars. I can get 10x return, so it's worth me investing in that. And they have probably less than 2 dozen projects going on at Google X, and you see a small number of them. You see cars, these fleet of Google cars. This was the last iteration where they took a bunch of Lexuses and retrofitted them for their experimentation. Now they're building their own cars. Google Glass, looking at eyewear that can project information to your eyes. They have a project that they've gone public on contact lenses that have sensors in them that can do things like measure the insulin, this blood sugar, in your tear ducts, which is a monstrous gain, monstrous improvement for the $300 billion diabetes problem we face in this country. And they're looking at new computing platforms like watches and new ways of distributing broadband connectivity, including using lower Earth weather satellites. A bunch of projects that at one level seem really kooky, but you can easily imagine for that company and the space they occupy, how it might be a 10x kind of return for them if it's successful. Now, when I say small, let me give you a sort of calibration. When Google announced a couple years ago that they had driven 200,000 miles with their driverless car without an accident, they're at about 750,000 miles now. But when they announced that they had gotten to about 200,000 miles and first went public, they had spent about $75 million on that project at that point. To give you some context, $75 million is about what GM would spend on a new bumper. Right? That's the level of investment we're talking about. $75 million is about what the industry spent on Super Bowl ads in the time that Google was working on a driverless car. So, relatively small investment. So, building a small basket of options so that you don't put to mix metaphors, you don't put all your eggs in one basket, but you're really taking sort of this high risk, high return kind of thinking. That's critical for starting small. So let's quickly talk a little bit about how you learn fast. This is a phrase from a good friend of mine, Gordon Bell, which I love. A demo is worth 1,000 pages of a business plan. You know, when Google started working in the car, they didn't have thousands of pages of market studies. They said, can we build it? Let's go see if we can build it, and we'll figure out the numbers later. And when they released it to the world, and the reason people got it right away, the reason that you got it right away was you saw that demo. You immediately understood it. It was about driving and riding cars. You got that right away. So demonstrations are really important. To take a different car example, Bob Lutz, who's a legendary car designer at GM, had a method that he used for new cars. He called it 9-3-1. He would take a new concept and give it to 3 different teams. And each of them would create 3 different concept models. So there'd be 9 overall. But they weren't out building cars. They were using clay, duct tape, plywood to do low-cost concept models. But they were cars. They were demonstrations. And then his team would come in and, of the 3 teams, pick 1 of each. You go from 3 to 1 in each of 3 teams. And then they would get to the point where they have 3 alternatives and go down to 1. So you spark massive creativity within the frame that you're hoping to learn more about at a low cost. And you break it down, and then by the end of that process, you have something that's worth perhaps going into your normal product development process. 9-3-1. But demos, demos from the perspective of not yourselves, but demos that you would show to the customers who would care about them. How do you construct those to really communicate an idea and to rigorously test the tires on it? That, I think, is really important to think about. So, rule number 8. Remember the devil's advocate. This is one thing that happens to every big idea. You fall in love with it. You could be the rogue element in this organization, as creative as possible. You're going to come up with some idea that everybody else at first says, that's kooky. And you say, no, I'm going to go through Chunka's process, I'm going to test it, I'm going to make sure that I'm rigorous. You will fall in love with it because that's what we do. Even more scary is Jim has an idea. And early on, he has to say, you guys, this is a great idea. And he tries to rally the organization around it. He has to act like he knows, understands it better than he actually does, because unless he's confident, you're not going to pay attention to him. More importantly, the way things usually go is that if it's a big transformative idea, he has to go to the board of directors and say, this will change the organization. I really believe it. He has to spend all his political capital just to get it started. He has to fall in love with it. Now the question is, do you have a process inside your organization, whether it's on your team or on the board, that says, you know what, that sounds like a really good idea, but I want to have some way of continually asking tough questions about that idea. So in the history of the Catholic Church, there was at one point an office in the Vatican that was nicknamed the Devil's Advocate. And the Devil's Advocate's job was to be part of every canonization process. So when essentially you consider somebody for sainthood. And the Devil's Advocate's job was to examine every piece of evidence. And with the charge of maintaining the long-term respectability and viability of the church, look at that candidate and say, is that piece of evidence right? Right, so it's not to be a naysayer, but it's to have, sort of the greater good in mind and to keep on asking tough questions. And the Catholic Church, in that process, no piece of evidence could be accepted into the canonization process if the Devil's Advocate did not accept it. The Devil's Advocate was a lowly person in the Vatican, but he had the power of asking tough questions. I think that is a critical thing to have as part of every innovation process. Is there somebody there that can ask questions about, hey, we had this assumption early on that this was going to do X, Y, and Z. Is that still right? Have we tested, have we vetted those numbers? Is that market share that we're anticipating, is that realistic? Questions like that keeps you honest. Because as Clay Christensen says, that innovation often fails not because you got an answer wrong, but you forgot a key question. You got the questions wrong. So getting the Devil's Advocate and asking the tough questions is really important. So to summarize, to think big, you have to get the context right, and you have to look at the upsides and the downsides. You have to expand the consideration set and not just think incrementally. To start small, you have to break the finance rules about traditional planning, but you also have to break the rules about traditional investments and traditional ways of operating around innovation. And you have to make sure that along the way, you get everybody on the same page. And then finally, to learn fast, you have to increase the cycle time. You have to, on one hand, do a lot of demonstrations, build a lot from the standpoint of the end consumer, the end customer, and you have to keep on asking the tough questions along the way. So let me close with a story. I heard it from my friend Guy Kawasaki, who's the chief evangelist at Apple. And he tells a story about a Stanford professor who one day pulls out a big mason jar and a bucket of rocks. And he starts filling the mason jar with these big rocks. He puts them in, puts them in, puts them in. Can't put any more big rocks in, and he asks his class, is the jar full? They said, yeah, looks kind of full. You can't get putting more rocks in there. And then he pulls out a bucket of gravel, fills the jar of gravel. Says, is the jar full? And they're starting to get into this. No, it's not full. Right, he pulls out a bucket of sand, fills it with sand. Says, is the jar full? What's the answer? No, the jar is not full. Pulls out a bucket of water, fills in the jar. So he asks, so what is the point of that story? And the class says, well, one guy says, well, it proves to us that no matter how full our plates are, we can always add more. And he says, no, that's not the point. The point is, If you want the rocks in, you have to get them in first. Think about innovation. Think about these eight rules as that mason jar, and the rules as those big rocks. You have to get them in. But your lives, your work is going to be filled with thousands of other things, the gravel, the sand, the water. And if you get those in first, you can't fit the rocks. But if you don't fit these rocks in, you're not going to succeed. Innovation is about getting these big things right so that you can continue on the path to success. Thank you.